End users don't really interface with PDL. Most of them don't even know what we are, but they know a lot of the tools and the customers that we power. Every company is a data company. Any company could be a data company. They'll come up to us at a conference or event and say, oh, I'm a PDL customer. And I'll be like, who are you? And I'll look them up in the CRM and I'll be like, I've never heard of this person. We don't have a SaaS product. So we're a lot more comfortable allowing SaaS products to build on top of our data. I always tell people we're strongest in the white collar English speaking West. We get our data from the public web. We also get our data from proprietary sources, but they're mostly companies that, we work with.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Data Exchange podcast. Today, we've got Ben Eisenberg from People Data Labs. How are you, Ben?
I'm good. How are you, John?
Doing excellent. Glad to have you on the show.
I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. Well, Ben, I think the first thing we like to just dig in with is a little bit of the background on yourself and what gave you the idea to start People Data Labs.
Yeah. So I had a really interesting journey with PDL, actually. So I started off as a data engineering intern. I met the two founders while I was in college, and they had sort of just pivoted the company that was called Talent IQ at the time to People Data Labs, and we're really starting to build out the data pipelines, the infrastructure, et cetera, to become a data as a service business. And I was lucky enough to get a front row seat to watch that business grow, and also to be in a really, really unique position where I was, sort of the bridge between our sales team, which was in San Francisco, which is where I was based, and our engineering team in Portland. And so, I got to grow with the company. I think we entered the data as a service industry at a really unique time. There was sort of this proliferation of SaaS tools and HR tech in sales and marketing. There was this proliferation of alternative data in investment research, and all of them were looking for high quality workforce data. And there were not a lot of providers on the market that were providing that. And so, right place, right time. And it's been a really, really awesome journey.
Very cool. Maybe we can dive in. I think you guys have a really cool kind of business model and commercial focus, but many of the data providers that we have on the show, they're really focused on bringing in that end user, whether that's a salesperson or a revenue operations professional. And that was before the whole AI thing. So that's kind of getting cluttered. But can you tell us a little bit about what types of customers that you guys serve? And is your focus more on powering platforms or powering end users?
Yeah. So we actually started off as an end user platform. So I mentioned that pivot from Talent IQ to People Data Labs. Talent IQ was really a tool for recruiters to go and find high quality engineering candidates. And then the pivot that we made is we realized that there was a lot more demand for the data itself. And so we pivoted from targeting the end users to actually powering platforms. And today, we don't have a user interface. End users don't really interface with PDL. Most of them don't even know what we are, but they know a lot of the tools and the customers that we power sort of across all of these different verticals. Our main focus is just building high quality data, making sure that it's really easy to access and use, making sure that it's clean, making sure that it's compliant so people can actually rely on it for building and growing their products. And what that's allowed us to do is really position in a very, very unique place in the market, especially with, like you mentioned, sort of the advent of enabled teams being able to build a lot faster and more easily, where enterprises that want to build their own internal tools or product teams that are just ISVs sort of building and wrapping on top of the data, instead of them needing to do all of the hard work of cleaning, collecting, standardizing data themselves, they can just sort of rely on us as their data foundation.
Yeah. Are you seeing an uptick in the number of companies, enterprises who are building their own internal products now that they can integrate into Claude and ChatGPT and any of their, or even agentic tools like N8N, et cetera?
Yeah. I think we've always said is every company is a data company. Any company could be a data company, right? They could do a lot of these things internally. And working with data gives you the ability to control all of the features that you want. It gives you the ability to merge internal and external data together. But historically, it's required just so much engineering effort that I'd say there's only been, specific niches and types of enterprises that have really focused on building their own data products internally. We've seen companies in very competitive industries build their own data-driven recruitment teams, or companies that are really targeting a specific ICP spend a lot of time putting, data engineering resources behind their sales team. But now, it's so much cheaper to sort of get started, and you don't need as much time and resourcing internally to actually work with the data. We're definitely seeing more companies at least start to experiment and try to use data in a lot of these workflows. And, I think there's a sort of a top-down initiative at a lot of these companies that they want to replace a lot of their software vendors with their own in-house tools. And so that's been a really, really awesome tailwind for us. And we've gotten to collaborate with a lot of cool companies and people.
Very cool. On that note, there's other workflow-based platforms, the Clays, the Common Rooms, and a bunch of startups trying to do similar things. Have you seen that go-to-market engineering type persona start to utilize your data sets in unique ways as well?
Yeah, and I would say they sort of self-identify as PDL customers, even though we're not directly interfacing with a lot of them. So the awesome thing about like our partnership with Clay, for example, is that they sort of wrap a lot of different data providers, but feature prominently the data providers that they believe to be high quality, good, compliant data. And so a lot of go-to-market engineers like to use PDL through Clay, do a lot of cool things with it, and then they'll come up to us at a conference or event and say, "Oh, I'm a PDL customer," and I'll be like, "Who are you?" And I'll look them up in the CRM and I'll be like, "I've never heard of this person." And it's because, they're consuming us through one of these third-party partners that has really enabled, right, in a similar way to how AI, I think, enables people to directly interface with the data. Some of these software tools that have built sort of this go-to-market engineering stack and made it easier for non-technical folks to interface with data, they're also using us a lot more. And sometimes we don't even know, right, exactly who they are, but they know who we are. And that's been really great exposure for us.
That's really cool. Yeah. Let's talk about data delivery. Are you guys more focused on API delivery, flat file delivery? Like, what's your mix of end user delivery?
Yeah, I always say that we go to where the customers are in terms of handing them the data, and different customers really have different ways that they want to interface with the data. And our goal is just to serve as many of them as possible. I always say we're like 50-50 API and flat file, which is never exactly the right number. And our finance team would be mad at me for saying it, but it's probably a good approximation in the sense that, people when they're starting out will often use APIs because it's consumption based. You don't have to commit as much resourcing to actually get going. And then many will graduate to a flat file and sort of build a full platform on a flat file. But that's sort of one of many different journeys that you can have when you're working with data. We have some customers that are very happy continuing on the API and just scaling their usage because they baked it into an application and they don't want to change sort of the back-end functionality. They're happy having PDL as their back-end. Or inversely, especially with some of these AI use cases, APIs are just impossible to use because they want to vectorize the data or build their own matching logic. And for those use cases, the flat file is often where they start. And so for us, it's really about partnering with our customers and understanding how they would technically want to integrate, what they're trying to do with the data, and then also helping them evaluate the data in the way that they're going to consume it at the end of the day. Because, consuming data through PDL's enrichment API, where we have our own matching logic, is very different. And it's a lot of the technical details are sort of obfuscated away in a way that when we hand you the flat file, facing a very, very different equation, right? You're facing duplication in the data. You're facing having to build your own matching logic and ranking logic. And, those are things that we have expertise in. Some of our customers have really great expertise in that. Some of them just don't even anticipate that those are things that they're going to run into. So for us, it's about educating all of our data buyers and making sure they understand both what they want to do, how they should do it, and then also how they should make sure that, we're the right fit for them or another provider is the right fit for them.
Yeah, and that probably even adjust industry by industry, like a healthcare provider who may have matching data may not even be allowed to send it out of their environment. So having a flat file is like a necessity because they can't even send the right match keys into an alternative system. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and that's a challenge too, right? Because, some of those folks might be regulated in terms of what they can send out of the house, but at the same time, do they have the technical expertise in-house to build their own matching, right? And, maybe they think they do, and then they're not able to get the lift that they expect. And so that's where we end up spending a lot of time with some of our enterprise customers, is really making sure that they're sort of foundationally set up for success. And I think that's also a big differentiator from a lot of the data market. I think a lot of companies, especially historically, I think this is slowly changing, were very transactional in terms of how they sold data. It was like, okay, you want 20,000 rows, like it's $1 a row, like pay me the money and I'll send you a spreadsheet of the data. But as the data sets have gotten bigger, as they've gotten more complicated, like the sales cycle and the process of buying data and working with providers has become a lot less transactional.
Yeah. One of the ways we get around that issue of just compliance is we work with tokenization partners that will tokenize the healthcare vendor provider's data, tokenize the PDL file, And now you've got like match keys on addresses without sharing any information across from one party to the other or even to us. So that's been a really good help. Partners like Datavant, DataRamp, they're companies that we work with to do some data tokenization. Let's talk about the commercial model because, it sounds like I'm going to guess that you guys have consumption and or all you can eat. What is that correct? And which model do you prefer?
Yeah, that's accurate. Data pricing is a very, very interesting game. I always just immediately go and pick on SaaS before I even talk about data pricing, which is SaaS pricing is really, really simple. Like you have a per seat price. It's pretty easy to keep that relatively fixed. There's not a lot of room for negotiation, coming together, et cetera, because there's so many costs behind the scenes, right? Supporting that product, and then you add features, right? So you talk about what things are coming up on your roadmap. You try to get customers to buy them. Your upsell cycles are also very natural. They're typically tied to your contract renewal when you are expanding or contracting the seats that somebody is purchasing. Data is very different, right? Like, when you're consuming data, your consumption needs are extremely fickle, hard to predict. You have built-in margin on your side that you're thinking about because often if you're consuming the data, you're then pushing it on to somebody else. And so thinking about that equation is very different on a customer to customer basis. Same thing with flat rate, all you can eat pricing, right? Like it doesn't cost PDL significantly more to regenerate the same file and send it to more people. So then, our flexibility on pricing is very high, but then how do you defend value, stick to value? And really, when I'm talking to customers, I'm always saying that it's an exercise of coming together on, the value that PDL believes our data is worth and your business and how you're using the data, et cetera. So really a lot of our pricing is dependent on the use cases, the fields, the rows that customers are receiving, or in the case of consumption-based, obviously how much they're consuming. And we're doing the exercise of coming together on price. I would say I prefer neither of them. I think it's a lot harder to sell data than it is to sell SaaS, but I think it's a really interesting problem and puzzle, especially as you start to get into the world of resellers or partnerships, et cetera, structuring a lot of those deals. I think it's a very interesting intellectual exercise that, only a specific type of salesperson really enjoys doing.
Yeah. Well, I've been doing it for 20 years, so I must be one of those people. But when you do sell file delivery, what are the mechanisms that you guys can deliver through? Is it SMTP? Or SCP? Is it do you have like Snowflake data shares? Can you drop it into S3? Like, how do you guys deliver the data?
Yeah. I always say that however customers want it, we can make it happen, like I said earlier. So yeah, everything that you listed, we can deliver to, basically any data sharing platform we probably integrated into. Sometimes customers will come to us with something new or unique, and then, it's an exercise of figuring out if we can do it and if we can do it in a cost-effective way. But over time, we've just sort of scaled into all the delivery methods that customers want. I would say in terms of trends in the industry, more and more people are looking to pull data from their provider instead of having the data pushed to them is something that we've noticed. So whether it's like a Snowflake share or a Databricks share where they're directly integrating and connecting with your instance, or it's like an S3 bucket that you create instead of an S3 bucket that they create. Those small nuances have changed over time, but generally, most people I think are on either AWS, GCP, or Azure and are looking to get the data there, or if they have like a data pipeline already built out in Snowflake or Databricks, they're looking to get the data there.
Yeah. I think going back to many data companies also do have that SaaS component. So they've got their user product, and that creates a lot of issue with their ability to license data to platforms for them to allow their customers to use it. And that creates a lot of challenges in building out contract terms. Can you tell us how you guys make it easy for platforms to build on your data when it comes to the terms of their use and how that differs from potentially other vendors that may have competing products that they've built?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on like the root of it right away, which is we don't have a SaaS product. So we're a lot more comfortable allowing SaaS products to build on top of our data. Generally, the thing that is a no-fly for us or requires some discussion is what I call programmatic resell of our data. So doing the things that we do and sort of repackaging the data and then doing the same thing. Like, if you were to deliver the data via API, if I shipped it off to you, you were to, take our flat file and then sell a flat file, right? Those are things that we contractually don't allow in our standard agreement, but obviously, right, like There's situations where we would form a partnership to do that. Other than that, it's really a matter of, allowing customers to do what we think is like commercially appropriate based on how much they're paying us. So like our standard terms have a couple of baseline things that we allow customers to do with the data. And then we also have a clause that basically says, hey, whatever we permit you to do in your purchase order with us, our order form, you're obviously permitted to do. And so, our sales cycle is really about understanding how customers are going to use the data, pricing the data appropriately. And then as use cases expand or change, that's one of our big expansion levers, especially with the flat file, right? When we work with big enterprises, they'll often have one use case and then we'll have them using us for a different use case and then a third and a fourth and a fifth. And that's really how we grow. Our contract value with an enterprise is, making sure that we continue to provide them with obviously the path to expand their use cases, but clear restrictions in the agreement as well.
Very cool. Maybe we can dig into the data a little bit now. Can you tell us what type of data, right? Contacts, companies?
Yeah. It's funny we've gotten so far and we haven't even really talked about what we offer. So we consider ourselves a workforce data provider. So the core of what we started with and what we built was a high quality data set of people's resumes, work history, education, skills, etc., linked to contact information to make the data actionable. So emails, phone numbers, etc. Over time, we continued to get customer feedback that, hey, if this data is really high quality, here are the adjacent rows, tables, columns that I could use to, continue to expand my product offering. And so from the person data, we also built a company data set that sort of is joinable to the work history and the education on the resume. And then we built out a job posting data set, which aggregates the sort of demand side jobs that companies are listing on their websites. And the cool thing that we've done is made all of these data sets joinable on our persistent company ID. And so they all sort of talk to each other. We use different features from the different data sets to make the other data sets better. And over time, what we try to do as a business and sort of our core vision is adding more tables, adding more different entities that sort of create a more complete and comprehensive picture of the workforce, adding more columns to our existing tables, right? New fields, attributes that help customers understand people, companies, and jobs better. And then finally, sort of adding rows and improving our coverage. We want to be the one-stop shop for workforce data. We want to be the one-stop shop for company data. We want to be the one-stop shop for jobs data. And we do that by just continuing to improve our coverage.
Very cool. Do you have different update intervals if you're buying flat files for those different tables?
Yeah. So the fastest update cadence that we have is the jobs data. Jobs data changes extremely fast. Most of the jobs that are posted today were probably not posted on June 8th. And most of the jobs that are posted on June 8th, we're recording on July 8th, so a month ago. Most of the jobs that were posted on June 8th are probably deactivated today. So you need to have a pretty fast update cadence to capture all of the changes that occur. And people really care about the timeliness of when those changes occur. On the person and the company data, we currently update the data monthly. That data is a little bit slower moving. Obviously, companies don't really change very frequently. And then even people, like you'd expect to want a faster update cadence, but the reality is most people don't update their resume for a couple of weeks after they've changed their job, if not longer. And right, like it's just a slower moving thing. People don't really change jobs that frequently. People don't really move locations that frequently. And so monthly has been the cadence that our customers have really asked for and requested.
Yeah, I think that's very standard. Is the job listings data, is that daily, weekly? How often do you?
Yeah, it's daily. So we can
nice.
push the data daily. We have our API endpoints that are automatically updated daily. A lot of customers host job boards on top of the jobs data. So, they're taking the data, repackaging it into an interface, right? And then some end users clicking on the actual jobs. And if they click on the job portal link and it's dead, like that's a really, really poor user experience, which is why it's so important to update that data on a daily basis. Yeah. By the time they would get another monthly update from us, for example, the jobs would probably not exist anymore. And they'd have like a platform that wasn't really working as their users anticipated.
If somebody wanted to buy job posting data for like only for RevOps positions, or can they slice and dice segments of that table and only license certain types of jobs?
Yeah, people could do that as a flat file. People can also do it in the API. So a lot of people who use the jobs data as a signaling tool just hit the API and filter for recently posted jobs matching certain criteria and sort of monitor that day over day. Yeah, there's some really interesting signals that you can generate from that. So there's obviously like hiring signals of like a company just decided to hire a RevOps person, for example. Another thing that we've seen is that a lot of companies reveal things that they probably wouldn't reveal elsewhere in their job. My go-to example, since I'm a data person, is data partnerships roles will often say the budget the data partnerships role has. when trying to attract someone to the job. Like, hey, you get to manage an 8-figure data partnerships budget versus a 7-figure data partnerships budget versus a 9-figure data partnerships budget. Like, that's great information for me as a seller looking at prospecting into that company or talking to the person who ended up filling that role. Another example of that, which is something that we're actually launching next week that we're very excited about, is you can see the technologies that companies are using, because for a RevOps role, they'll say if you need to use Salesforce or HubSpot in the role. And so there's some really, really great deterministic signals that are very timely about what technologies a company is using at a given point.
Very cool. Yeah, maybe we can get into some stats and segments now around how many contacts do you have in the database?
Yeah, so always a tough question to answer, just because what we do that's really cool is we have this identity graph where we're trying to join contact information, consumer information, et cetera, to the resume profile. So our core resume data set is about 800 million profiles, and that's what most of our customers are relying on for building their platforms. But our identity graph overall contains about 2.1 billion identities. Now, obviously, they're maybe not all representing unique people where, we're doing record linkage to try to confidently link people together. And there's, 100 Ben Eisenbergs in the US. Like, we can't just merge them all together, but 2 Ben Eisenbergs that have some information that's related, like we have to make probabilistic decisions about whether or not we want to merge them. So there's some level of duplication in that 2.1 billion graph, but we think we have pretty good coverage of especially the white collar English speaking West.
Yeah, I got 2 questions that come off of that one. One is, I'm guessing it has to be, this is your contacts are global, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And you are GDPR compliant?
Correct, which, I'm happy to dive into. One of the things that we're very focused on is just making sure that we're in compliance with all the different global laws. And that landscape is just constantly changing these days.
Yeah. Even in the US, there's just so many changes that are happening right now. But you mentioned the 2.2 billion. Do you ever license that identity graph for any use cases, or is that all in-house proprietary?
We do. I would say that there's a very limited number of customers that want sort of the full undeduplicated graph. You sort of need to have a certain level of specialization in terms of working with data. And going back to my programmatic resale point earlier, I'd say a lot of folks that have the capability to ingest that graph are probably in the category of folks that we need to have kind of more specific and direct conversations about what they're doing with the data before we would license it to them.
Yeah. More of a digital use case, like companies using maids and hems and activating for digital marketing, or.
Yeah. And there's some challenges there from a compliance standpoint as well, right? So there's, a category of companies that we probably wouldn't sell to from a compliance standpoint. There's a category of companies, let's say like B2B data companies that would be maybe interested in our whole graph, but, if they're reselling the file, I don't know that we would be able to work with them immediately. I think, there's always a conversation about a creative structure, but just out of the gate. But then there's like the third category, which I think there's like niche use cases where we feel comfortable selling that graph sort of right off the bat. But like the customer also has to feel comfortable ingesting and using the data and that they're going to get value out of it. And I would say in our 10 plus years, many people who say they want the whole graph end up not wanting the whole graph and realizing, that there's a lot of challenges with taking on such a big data set.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons we created our InstaDB platform, is because it is such a challenge. You got to unpack it, you got to denormalize it, you normalize it, you've got to ingest it, and then, hey, querying a 2.2 billion record set and joining it with other tables, all that, it's very expensive on AWS and Azure and GCP. So not to mention the cloud engineers, the data engineers, the data scientists, like you have to have a solid team to be able to work with an identity graph like that. But that's really cool that you guys are open to certain use cases there. Maybe we can move to the business side. Guessing you have general firmographics like revenue, employee size, location, headquarters, all that stuff.
Yeah, the way I always describe our company data is, sort of the grounding of it is building a really great firmographic identity graph. So website, address, company name, etc. And then appending onto it different things that describe the business, whether that's the size of the business, right? The revenue, the employee count, the funding, etc., or what the business does. So like tags, descriptions of the business, industry classifications, etc. Those are sort of the 2 things that we append on. And then really the secret sauce or the differentiator in the PDL company data set is what I was mentioning before, that we actually aggregate information from our person data and our job posting data to sort of make the company data set better. So a couple of examples of that are, we have our headcount insights package where we track employee count, over time, employee count by role over time, movement between companies by role. Basically, we use the company ID as a primary key and do different aggregations on the person data that we then digest into the company data. Same thing we can do with the job posting data, right? Like how many jobs have they posted every single month over the last, 5 years? Really interesting signal from that data.
Very
And then
cool.
the third thing is, like the technology data where, you can actually see the, references in the job posting data or references in people's resumes to certain technologies and aggregating that to the company data in a way that's deterministic and you can sort of unpack is something that not a lot of vendors do. There's many vendors that provide what they call technographics. And really technographics is very frequently a black box of how it was generated, where it came from, how timely it is. And the nice thing about what we're calling technology data or technologies used is we actually are seeing direct citations of this technology being used or described in the resumes and the job posting data. We can expose that to our customers. So that's something that we're really excited about.
Very cool. And is that something you offer today as the technologies used?
Yeah, it's actually launching next week. So we're getting an advanced preview on this call, but I'm sure by the time this goes live, it'll be out in the world.
Very cool. Congratulations. What haven't we covered? Phone number data. Let's talk about like the actual contact information, phone numbers and emails. Tell me how you guys consider yourself in terms of your strength on, mobiles and email addresses for businesses.
Yeah, I'd say there's a couple of reasons we think we have high quality data and sort of the output that we provide to our customers. The first is that we have a process for testing every single source that we ingest, both, compliance, diligence, etc., but also looking at the actual accuracy of the linkage on the records. So whether that's, a phone number to a name or a phone number to a social profile or a phone number to an email. We have golden records that we test every single, source or partner that we work with against to ensure that they're high quality coming in. We then have our own proprietary record linkage process internally to try to merge more of that data together. And we have a series of quality checks that we run on that record linkage process to make sure that it's, keeping matches that we generate probabilistically high and not generating what we call Frankenstein records of two people being erroneously merged together into one person. And then finally, at the output stage, we have a series of QA checks that we run of sort of benchmarking our data against other sources of truth. There's a lot of providers these days, both for phones and emails, that do deliverability validation, but also do like associativity validation, where they're looking at like, is this phone number correctly associated with this person? Is this phone number accurate? Is this email associated with the right person? Is it accurate? Is this their primary, mobile number or their primary email, or is it a secondary one? We look at a lot of those external signals as sort of the final step of validation and sort of benchmark ourselves over time. And because of that, we come out typically very high when people do like data vendor evaluations or benchmarks. It's impossible to say how accurate a data set of 800 million people is overall, right? But what we can do is continue to take samples of the data, continue to look at the data and run our own evaluations, and then also listen to customer feedback. When we start to hear feedback about one of our different data fields or attributes, whether it's contact information or the timeliness of jobs or accuracy of locations, we take that very seriously and we spend time investigating it and digging into it with customers and their methodology for generating samples, maybe that, look good or don't look good. And we use that to continue to improve our benchmarking. So like we've learned a lot, from working with Clay and seeing how they benchmark, because, a lot of people rely on and listen to their benchmarks, and their benchmarks impact placement in the waterfall, etc. And we've taken a lot from, how they're approaching that and applied it into our own QA process as well.
Very cool. What about email validation? Do you offer that as a service, like its own API, or do you actually build in email verification signals into your payloads?
So we try to validate all the emails in our data, and the goal is to have our top level sort of current work email, current personal email fields be as deliverable as possible. That doesn't mean that when a customer goes to try to email a given individual that like the email will still be deliverable. And so there's a lot of challenges sort of in talking about email deliverability, as there is with everything in data, right? There's just a lot of nuance. We do our own validation in-house. We also work with some services to do validation to make sure that our top level fields are as deliverable as possible. But we also encourage our customers to use other deliverability services to validate the data. We don't have our own email validation API today. And the primary reason for that is honestly customer feedback. Customers have said if we give them data they're sort of assuming that it has a certain level of accuracy and they don't want to come back to us and have to pay us more to validate if the data is accurate. It creates kind of like a very friction-filled experience. So our goal is to just make the data as good as possible when it goes out the door. And then, if customers want to continue to validate it, which is advisable, right? Like even one day after we validate the email, it might go invalid. Then they can do that, and they probably should.
Very cool. Global data means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So maybe what we could do is, can you tell us where you feel like you guys are strongest globally, and then potentially a weak spot or two if you have any?
Yeah, I always tell people we're strongest in the white collar English speaking West. We get our data from the public web. We also get our data from proprietary sources, but they're mostly companies that, we work with. So they're companies in the West that are probably focused on the West. So our data is the strongest in those pockets. Our data is weakest sort of in the inverse of that, right? Like blue collar space, international, sort of like Asia, Africa, South America, right? Places where there's not as much of an online footprint is generally where we're weakest. But I think it really depends on the use case to determine if our data is strong or not, which is why we always encourage people to test. So the example I always give is we work with a Japanese auto manufacturer. And one of the first things we said to them was, hey, our employee count for all the major auto manufacturers in Asia is probably going to be way off from what the actual employee count is, because we just don't have the frontline workers in our data. We don't have, the factory workers in our data. And we're not even confident that we're going to have 100% coverage of the white collar workers. But what was interesting was their use case was tracking self-driving car developers that are employed by all of these different, Asian auto manufacturers. And surprisingly, PDL actually does have very strong coverage in that small niche, stronger than any other provider that they had evaluated. And so they ended up working with us. But I think if you had put a gun to my head at the start of the conversation and said, would we end up working with this auto manufacturer? The answer probably would have been no, just based on my sort of initial, read on our coverage versus what I would have expected them to want. But, it always just comes down to what's your use case, right? Like sometimes the data works for a use case that you wouldn't expect. And then inversely, sometimes even though we're strong in the white collar English speaking West, there's pockets where, maybe the data doesn't perform as well, or it's not as timely as people need, or, some other nuance that, we didn't think about for that specific use case.
Very cool. Yeah, this has been an incredible chat with you about your background, the company's background, your licensing structures, your delivery structures, the data. You guys are building some incredible stuff, and just to hear your journey should give people that are in this industry in a place where they're starting out as an individual contributor a lot of excitement about where they could be someday, because you've been building this company for quite some time, and I'm seeing your data injected in a lot of really great places. And recently we even started a partnership. So one last kind of question I want to ask you is what drove your interest in the SpringDB Data Exchange?
Yeah, I think anytime we have like mutual customers with someone, that's always like an interesting catalyst or start to a relationship. It's challenging to navigate or determine, right, like what partners are going to provide value. But when you have really good customer stories right out of the gate, I think that always is something that feels very validating for us. And we were lucky that, we have a joint customer that I think has been pretty satisfied with SpringDB, and hopefully very satisfied with PDL as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, we've known each other for a long time, Ben, and I know that you guys are doing tremendous work over there and have a lot of really great clients. So keep up the good work, and thank you so much for joining us on today's episode.
Yeah, thank you for having me, John, and thank you for all the kind words. Excited to see where this partnership goes.
Awesome.